Hello, internet friends and the two other people who are in this room.
Hi.
We are a new symbolization project. We are the Critical Theory and Social and Political Philosophy Club here at Boise State University. And we like to have non-reactionary and non-capitalist realist dialogues. Speaking of capitalism, today we're going to be discussing Wage, Labor, and Capital by our favorite, Karl Marx, which talks about the relationship between wage, labor, and capital, which is really important. Talks about some really important concepts of understanding capitalism and the systems within it. So I would say, let's introduce ourselves. But there's three of us here, and I think you know all of us. I'm Anne. This is Dave. This is Sky.
And I also go by Lisa.
Dave or Lisa.
Because I did share links for this.
True.
Where I go by Lisa primarily, which is... And then Kenneth.
And Kenneth on Google Hangouts.
Kenneth, are you going to be joining us by microphone at all today, or are you just kind of watching? Okay, eyeballs.
Watching.
He did the signal, if anyone didn't catch that. All right.
And it looks like Adam and Michael are watching.
Oh my God, two of my favorite people are on our Facebook right now. Cool. Well,
sweet.
I have this reader that Natalie Wynn of ContraPoints critiques in the left video. She's not critiquing the content, she's critiquing the aesthetic.
The ugly cover, look at this.
I mean, just look at it, how it compares to my purple, and it's so 20th century. So, how did you want to leave this thing off?
I guess maybe just talking about some, maybe going through and clarifying any things that we needed to before we can really get into the discussion. Because before this, I asked Dave to kind of explain division of labor, and that's definitely where I would like to start, is maybe just going over some things to clarify, get a better understanding, and go over any big questions about the text. Cool.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll say before beginning that part is just to say that why this? Why is it still relevant? Why does it matter? We still live in capitalism. It's a different phase of capitalism than the one Marx was writing in. But as it turns out, almost everything he's saying is still pertinent and necessary for understanding where we're at now. And I would add that you can't really understand, or truly criticize capitalism without having this kind of fundamental basis. And that the reason we wanted to do this one specifically is, we kind of did it previously in the semester when we were doing a joke thing.
Yeah.
But we never actually got to really discuss it. Not all of us, right? And so one of the special things about wage, labor, and capital is that Marx writes this after the 1844 manuscripts and before he writes Capital. So this is basically us. This is the people in this book call it the germ of Capital. Basically, everything in here unfolds into Capital, and then he really just adds a whole lot of historical and economic evidence to what he's doing in Capital. But the nice thing is that it's so condensed, and it's really pretty clear. I don't know, it seems more clear to me now, maybe because I've already read it in the past, but probably the hardest part to get the hang of is just the fact that he has 10 clause sentences, and that's very, very typical of the day. But back then, proletarians who worked their whole lives in factories and mines could read this. So if they can do it, we can do it. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion. And Mikey, I hope that you'll be able to hop into the Hangout. I don't know if I shared the link to you personally, but for anyone wondering how to get the link to the Hangout so that you can join for the conversation, it is in the Facebook event. Just go in there. Kenneth Freeman posted a post in there asking for the link. The link got shared into the comment of that, and so you'll be able to get it there if you want to join that way. Without further ado, is there anything we need to know about what they're saying in there? Oh, never mind. Yeah, this page replaced the Cascadia network. Okay.
Where's the Google link?
Okay. So Mikey is asking about it. But perhaps you could take the link that was shared into into Freeman's post in the actual event page and just share it into the comment stream for this live thing. Anyway, so while thank you. And while we're doing that, we can probably just begin with collecting some necessary terms.
Yes.
And I think the real goal here is to gain a better understanding of the reading ourselves, but also try to, in the course of this discussion, articulate the basics of the argument, be able to summarize it, and say how these different pieces all fit together. Because with Marx, as well as like any truly innovative philosopher, no concept stands alone. They are breaking us out of our normal way of perceiving to see what goes on beneath. So at the very beginning, he talks about how political economists like Ricardo and Adam Smith had already seen that labor was important to value in capitalism, but what they were not able to see was what underlies that. And so what he wants to show is that it's not just like, oh, I walk into the place and start selling my labor to the capitalist, and that's the basis for value. No, there's a whole lot more going on beneath that. And this is all pretty essential for NSP, the New Civilization Project, because, I mean, this gets to our very logo. Our very logo has on it this T and this E. That's actually what that is. The logo is like a T and an E. It stands for time energy. Time energy is basically what's necessary for labor as well. We could call it labor power, or the capacity to labor. Okay, so, but before we can even get to concepts like labor power, let's talk about some of the basic terminology. So yes.
Yes.
Division of labor. Does anyone want to take a stab at division of labor? I'm assuming that Mikey's probably in a coffee shop right now. So the division of labor.
Yeah, I am in a coffee shop, and now they're kicking me out because they didn't tell me they were closing early. So now I've got to like drive home.
Can we can't hear you. Hold on. Is our volume even on? I think
what about now?
Now we can hear
you. There we
go. Okay. No, I'm gonna have to actually head out. I'm at a coffee shop, but they just informed me that they're closing early, so I got to drive home. So I'll hop back in when I'm at home.
Okay.
Okay. Well, what's the division of labor, Mikey?
It is just the multiplication. It has to do with simplifying labor, right? The more you can simplify labor, break it down into component parts. Eventually, Marx's point is that the more you simplify labor, the cheaper it becomes. So there's this kind of profit aspect to it. It's part of the profit mechanism, where the more and more you can simplify labor, make it cheaper, you can make relative wages go down, which of course means more profit for the capitalist. But division of labor just simply amounts to dividing labor into a whole series of component tasks that make it where one aspect of the production of commodity X gets relegated to different people, and not one person or even just one group of workers has to do the whole thing themselves.
Yeah, that's great. So like an example might be that in, let's just say that you have a chef, and part of their crew, here, I'm going to mute you. Oh, you did it yourself. Hey, welcome.
Hello. Hello.
Who has joined us? All right. Well, you can introduce yourself if you want to, or we'll just kind of keep on with the conversation. But we're talking about the division of labor, and I was just going to use an example really quick, and I was going to say that you have, let's just say what all goes into making a sandwich. It's not just putting the ingredients onto the bread and then like handing it to the customer. There's also the preparation of the meats and the cheese and the lettuce, the tomato, what have you, and that. In the division of labor, you have one person do the prepping, then you have another person do the combining, and then you have another person at the register. So each person is doing a simplified task so they can do more of it, and it's simpler, which de-skills their labor, which makes it higher. It also makes it more. Hello. Hello. Friend. Getting a lot of feedback. You might want to try using headphones or something like that. That could help, so that we don't have this feedback issue. Perhaps, I'm not sure. But for now, you're muted, and we'll unmute you later or you can unmute yourself if you can figure out how to make that feedback not occur. Okay, so that answers the division of labor question, right? So I think what we want to be able to show here is how first of all, what is wage labor? What is capital? How do they relate? And what are the implications of this analysis, for better or for worse? What are the implications of this analysis, such as competition and the kinds of competition that capitalism fosters? How do those affect the capitalists? How does that affect the workers? How does the division of labor, even though it makes us more efficient and productive, play into this distinction between the worker and the capitalist? And then how does this all affect wages and the growth of capital?
So is there somewhere like you are looking to begin in there, or
no, not yet.
Okay.
There's a few places you read off. Do you have anything?
I guess we can start by just breaking down wage labor and capital. Those are important. That's the name of this essay.
Want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, sure. Well, wage labor takes into consideration like a lot of different aspects and so you have like labor power, and all of these other things coming into it. Basically, to get down to the work that you do that gets you your means of subsistence, I guess, is kind of like what wage labor is. It's a lot more than that, as Marx explained, but like getting down to the basics, I feel like it is the work that you do to get money.
Right. Yes, exactly. Let's talk about means of subsistence really quick. What do you understand that to mean?
The means of subsistence are basically what you need to like maintain yourself and to like the basic necessities of living. So shelter, food, water, all of those basic necessities are what I understand it to be.
Cool, yeah. So what's different between capitalism and say what comes before capitalism in terms of wage labor? What comes before wage labor? What are other ways people have been organized with their labor? He gives a couple of examples. He uses the serf and the slave as an example. So for me, that's page 205 in this Marx Engels reader. But he says that labor power was not always a commodity. Labor was not always wage labor, that is free labor. The slave did not sell his labor power to the slave owner any more than the ox its services to the peasant. The slave, together with his labor power, is sold once and for all to his owner. He is a commodity which can pass from the hand of one owner to that of another. He is himself a commodity, but the labor power is not his commodity. The serf sells only a part of his labor power. He does not receive a wage from the owner of the land. Rather, the owner of the land receives a tribute from him. So the idea was, both of these are kind of like extreme examples, right? Because on the one hand, the slave has absolutely no say, right? Mm-hmm. And basically their entire life and all of their labor power, or which is to say capacity to do labor, is owned by the person who's bought them or whatever. Then you have the serf, who they don't own the land they live on. They probably live on some land in common. Maybe it is called their land because they're on it or whatever. But but basically, they're able to produce goods or services from that point, and then they, to justify their existence and to pay for the protection of the feudal lord, will offer a tribute. So it's like a percentage of what they are producing is going to the feudal lord. Capitalism comes in, frees the labor in the sense that now you're able to go and sell your labor on the labor market as a commodity to capital, to the interests of capital. And he says, like, while you're able to quit your job and you go work for someone else, for instance, the one thing you cannot quit is that you are subservient to and always going to be working for capitalists.
Yeah, and so it's interesting you say how he says, like, you're free to do this, but you're not really free. It's so long as this system of capitalism exists in which you need to be a part of it to, again, acquire those means of subsistence. So you're not actually free. You can't actually be free under capitalism because, yeah, you might be able to leave your job, but then what? Like, you literally cannot survive. So
yeah, this is why I say that there's no free speech under capitalism, because you're constantly having to court favor with your employers, right? And so you can't really say your real opinion about your employer, for instance. And often you can't even have your real political opinion out in the open because you've got to kind of walk this fine line.
Well, the government can't control what you say. You can definitely, your employer has that power over you. So it's almost like a bunch of tiny petty dictatorships.
Yeah.
That are controlling you and your speech. Yeah.
And if you burn one bridge,
burn them all.
They can, because everyone wants job references. So it's like this, yeah, it follows you. I thought there was a good example of what we mean by symbolization. A new symbolization project. Let me close that so that's not making that noise. All right, closed out. Sorry, everybody. Had to close. We're getting notifications back on our. Anyway, okay. On my page 207, he talks about. I'm just going to substitute African American. Actually, no, I'll just say a black person. He says a black person is a black person. He only becomes a slave in certain relations, right? He's talking about how, you know, if you talk to an economist and you use their logic, they would say that the black slave is by definition a person of the black race. But he's like, that doesn't make that assumes something that and actually I kind of jumped a step here by doing the thing I did on the screen and jumping back into here. But basically the point is that a person's a person. What gives them like the status of a slave is going to be a certain ordering of relations of power. Mm-hmm. Same thing goes for the wage laborer or the capitalist. What gives them that status and rank in a society has to do with the system of relations that are there.
All of this talking about, like, I know this is kind of different, but it reminds me of, because Dave and I are reading this book called, it's just like Capitalism, a conversation between Nancy Fraser and, I don't know, the other person.
Rahel Jaggi?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it talks about, like, in capitalism, exploitation versus expropriation. Expropriation being like confiscating, just like straight up confiscating people's labor. And so this talk of like the slavery kind of, I know like that's not really what Marx is talking about, but it just reminded me a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And I kind of was making those connections because even today we still see the both exploitation and expropriation as Fraser explained and how they relate to each other and you can't have one without the other. So I was just like making those connections while reading this and reading about like the social relations and it has to do with race and like all those kind of play into it. I thought that was an interesting connection.
Yeah, I really like the work that Fraser is doing to expand and extend this basic line of critique. She gets a lot more into the pre-economic conditions for capitalism that are kind of always with us. That, you know, so like the expropriated and exploited labor power of women or marginalized people who aren't even granted certain rights or status within the system of capitalism. Maybe they work outside of the system of capitalism, but they're not really outside of it, because without them doing that work, the system itself would fall apart. Which also gets back to the idea of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I kind of assumed that we'd have a couple more people in here who, like, for instance, including Mikey. But oh, I was just gonna say that what I think I'll probably just do is that we can just kind of take turns moving down through our notes.
Okay, yeah.
And just see if we can unpack this thing.
Yeah.
We're ultimately building up to being able to make sense of what seems like a pretty simple summary at the end of the essay, when Marx says, "Let us sum up. The more productive capital grows, the more the division of labor and the application of machinery expands. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery expands, the more competition among the workers expands, and the more their wages contract." Then finally, at the very, very last part of this, he says, "If capital grows rapidly, competition among the workers grows incomparably more rapidly. That is, the means of employment, the means of subsistence of the working class decrease proportionately so much the more, and nevertheless, the rapid growth of capital is the most favorable condition for wage labor." So they're saying it, and then they're showing how that functions, right? And I think that a lot of people have a basic sense that capitalism implies competition, that competition is necessary for capitalism. But if that's the most you've got to say about the matter, then you aren't going to get a lot of traction with people who might not have a problem with capitalism or might not really have thought very deeply about this yet, because it's probably pretty obvious to anybody, like, competition is everywhere in life. It's not just a thing of capitalism. So what's unique about how capitalism functions, or how competition functions within capitalism? And that's what we'll want to break down here, I think. I'm going to read this message really quick.
Didn't Marx already get destroyed at the RMAC Heritage event?
You're right, Benjamin.
But I actually wanted to participate and say real things about this and not criticize Marx for using shillings or whatever.
So yeah,
I have real thoughts.
For the people who aren't in the Facebook chat here, Benjamin Warnell asked, "Didn't we already destroy Marx?" Basically, when we read this earlier in the semester, Anne was...
I was the vice president of a fake club on campus called Tributes Our American Heritage. And the whole point of our reading Marx was to, like, be able to understand the left better so we can destroy them. And so at this meeting...
As a fake conservative.
As a fake conservative club, yes. So Athen and I just, like, made terrible points about how it sucks, how his writing's terrible, how, like, labor and labor power are the same thing, and which all of that I don't agree with. So I'm really glad we're here discussing it seriously today.
Benjamin probably just has mind blown. He probably thought you were actually Anna. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm not. It's not me. I'm a real person.
And Kenneth Freeman says that although Adam Smith did not advocate for the division of labor per se, feudal at one end and even more feudal at the other, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so you're right that Adam Smith Well, okay, so Adam Smith was basically just like, look, it's very efficient, it's very productive. There are goods and there are bads that come with the division of labor. And, I've read like half of The Wealth of Nations, and in it, he spends a lot of time talking about how the saddle maker used to walk out of their cottage in the morning and they'd wander on over to the shop. They'd stop and smell the flowers on the way over and maybe play with their dog. And then they'd get there and then they'd, make saddles for rich people all day. But they could really take their time and they could put a lot of quality and effort into it. Under capitalism, you have the division of labor and the development of the means of production in the factory setting, meaning that no longer is one person overseeing the entire process. Now you've got, you're making 100 saddles per hour, and you've got hundreds of people on lines, like doing very specific tasks, and it's very monotonous, but it makes them highly efficient, highly productive. The problem, because we like efficiency, we like productivity. The problem is that those workers, now that their labor is so cheap, so it's been de-skilled so far down, they are very easily replaceable by other people, which means they're now competing for lower wages because you've got you just got people competing for jobs, and so and then ultimately the alienation factor, which is not talked about too much in here, but the alienation factor is that the product of their labor they do not own. They've been given a wage instead, and that wage is pretty much just enough to continue their measly existence here on the planet, so they can keep working.
Yeah, it's just this cycle of get ready for work, go to work, make the money to have the money to be able to replenish yourself, to go back to work, to get the wage, and it just goes over and over, and you're trapped in this cycle.
Yes. What else? I think that does it. We're good.
Okay, yeah, thanks for...
Peace, everybody.
No. I don't know, did we just want to go through?
Yeah.
From does yours have the label, or each section?
No, mine for some reason does not. Mine is actually abridged a little bit.
Okay.
So.
Well,
all right. Well, okay. I think that the most important point is that because labor power is a commodity, there's a law about commodities within capitalism that we need to be wary of, because it has huge implications for how this is going to pan out. Because people say, okay, well, all of that might be true, but ultimately, hey, there's trickle-down economics, meaning that if the employer you're working for, if you enrich them enough, then you're going to ultimately be able to get paid more, giving you more money, ultimately giving you more access to commodities, meaning that you'll be pretty well set.
So, here's the thing with that, is Marx says, okay, so if the capitalist makes more money, yeah, you might make more money, but then if they're making more money, the money that you're making doesn't really matter, and it doesn't have the same value, because if their profit is going up, then commodities and the means of subsistence, the price of that could also go up, because if everyone's making more money, then really you're not making any, in relation to the price of commodities and the value of everything else, you're actually not making, you have more money,
you get more wages,
but it doesn't really do anything.
But more wages does not equal more capital. And so that's one of the interesting things also, is just that capital is not equal to wealth, that they are different. It's not, capital is not just having some extra money in your bank account. It's having ownership of the means of production. It's having ownership of accumulated surplus labor, which is to say the profit that comes from not compensating people the value that they've produced in that setting, and being able to mobilize that capital towards the expansion of capital, basically. Capital is not capital if it's not growing itself, right? The capitalist is subservient to the growth of capital, otherwise they stop being a capitalist. And under capitalism, if you're not growing, you're on your way out. And so that imperative to compete and to stay on top of your game drives a couple of things. Now, in the feudal situation, you have that feudal lord who's getting tribute from serfs, and they're able to basically then, it's all symbolic. You want to throw a lot of parties, you want to be the coolest person around, maybe the scariest person around, or whatever. But at the end of the day, you weren't always calculating and looking to maximize your profits in this same way. Now, under capitalism, though, you've got to be always thinking about, one, research and development for the evolution of your means of production. That way, you keep your competitive edge. And then the other one is basically you have to find ways of making the work itself simpler and simpler, cheaper and cheaper, and that just means like continuing to drive that division, the division of labor. Cool, Mikey's back, and hey Benjamin, we can't see any of the stuff you're saying. Can you get into Google Hangouts if you wanna? I don't know. That'd be rad if you could.
Open the live stream on my phone.
That's just the tribute.
Sky can read it. Oh, is it?
Yeah, that's
okay.
just the same one.
Cool. So you're gonna add to that. And it's also important to point out that the minimum wage then is not equal to the living wage, which is obviously true here in Idaho. The minimum wage is something like $7.50, $7.90, something like that, whereas the living wage would be something like $15 an hour.
It's just the minimum wage of what the capitalists can pay for you to be able to acquire your means of subsistence so they can get the most profit.
And even then, Marx points out that that minimum wage isn't always enough to pay for everybody. Like imagine, because like let's just say that you break your leg. Now the most basic cost of paying for your subsistence is no longer enough because you have like this additional cost that you've incurred. So even though it's really just an average. It's supposed to work for most people. And the reason that wages have the tendency to always go down to that ground floor level is because of this law of competition in respect to commodities. So let's just say that, and he uses various examples, but like, let's just say that you have a given commodity. Was it like linen cloth? You're weaving it or something like that, and you've got the people working in the factory, and because you've upgraded the machinery, all of a sudden you're able to produce twice as much in the same amount of time. So what do you do with that extra profit, right? Do you keep selling it for the same price? Of course not, because you've got to stay competitive against the other people who are also doing this. Otherwise, they'll undercut you. So instead, you undercut them, but you don't undercut them as low as you can possibly go. No, because you also want to put some of that money into further research and development so that you can make the means of production even better, right? Also, probably to branch out into other areas of production as well. So you've basically got to always keep that capital on the move, and it's not to go, and it can't go back to the workers. You've got to keep them ultimately working at whatever the lowest amount you're able to pay them, because the labor that they are doing in making these commodities is itself a commodity that they're selling, that commodity. And gosh, I'm like having a hard time tying this together. I had a whole thought. Mikey, do it. Help me.
Capitalists essentially want the price of wages to go down because the capitalists are in competition with one another. So the more money that they have to invest in production and advertising and so on and so forth, they gain greater control of the market. And so one of the main ways for them to get to up their profits is to pay less in wages. So that's the motivation. And again, it has nothing to do with greed or an immoral character. It has to do with the very logic of the system. And that's what you'll find him emphasizing, is that, capital is a logic. It's not some greedy asshole being a greedy asshole. And that's what we get a lot of the time in America is if there is any kind of anti-capitalism, it's always just the moral character of those assholes on Wall Street and all that, when in fact, they're really just following a kind of structural logic that they don't have any control over. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, greed can be part of it, but that's not what's essential. And so the idea of lowering wages, paying workers as little as you possibly can, it has to, yeah, I like what Kenneth said, a perverse incentive, right? It's the perverse incentive of the system itself pulling the strings, and that's kind of what he's getting at here. Because guys like Adam Smith and them, they're going to act like capital is just this good thing through and through. It's productive. Look what it makes. Look at the society it builds. But Marx is highlighting this perverse dimension of the very structure of how capital goes about accumulating.
Nice.
I would just add in, just as kind of a little supplement, when you were talking about going through these different terms and defining them, one of the key things that Marx highlights is that social relations are actually a part of capital. A lot of the political economists, Smith, Ricardo, they're going to talk about capital as raw materials or means of production, stuff like labor power, but they don't talk about the social relations between capitalists and wage labor as part of capital itself. And that's one of the big things to take away from his definition of capital, is that these exploitative, asymmetrical social relations are an essential structure of capital accumulation.
Yeah, I really like that point that you drive home about, and I think it just always has to be reaffirmed that real leftists aren't going after individuals, they're going after systems. And if we do go after actual individuals, it's only to make a point, right? Like, sure, we can go after individuals. Like, yeah, building a guillotine to send like implicit threats to the people in power, sure, but like not because any one of them is like the devil, and by getting rid of them, we'd have taken care of the problems. No. Neoliberals and classical liberals, or libertarians and conservatives and Democrats alike, often will like, oh, it's crony capitalism, oh, it's corruption on Wall Street, or it's corruption in the government, or it's it's super PACs and lobbyists and all of these different things. And it's like, well, those all have their part to play, but it's the fucking system itself.
Yeah.
Why does the system allow for that? When you have something like let's just like think of like a game of sport ball. What's a kind of sport ball people will play?
Football. Soccer.
So does anyone know any of the rules?
I know all the rules of soccer.
Do you really?
Yeah, I'm a soccer referee.
Okay, so you have a game. People have sets of conditions and operating kind of procedures to work within so that they can achieve success or glory or what have you within that given system. But without some of the rules there, without people getting penalties for doing certain things, then people would do those things more.
Yeah.
Right? So let's just say you can't purposely trip somebody or you'll get penalized, right? Well, if you don't have that rule in place, then people are going to be incentivized to trip. And the liberal would say, well, then we just blame people who are tripping people because they're bad people. And it's like, no.
No, the whole system is almost encouraging you to trip people. Yeah, you can't say that, oh, it's just our system of capitalism that's corrupt. And we're literally seeing this corrupt system in the goddamn 1800s. Oh, it's just been the bad eggs for the past 200 years. No.
Well, real capitalism, though.
Real capitalism. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of funny, but a lot of the time it helps to think of capital as a person, kind of like Dossmann, right? Dossmann and Heidegger, it's not an actual person. It's not an actual big subjectivity like God in the sky watching us, but it's like that. It has you can kind of anthropomorphize it in a way that's helpful. Capital would like for us to build guillotines and cut off capitalist heads because it totally hides that capital is the one pulling the strings. It's just these people with their moral imperfections doing everything, which lets capital off the hook. So capital itself would applaud that. It would be fine. Oh, go ahead, cut their heads off, because 10 more will just, sprout up in their place. So again, it's kind of like how Foucault talks about how power circulates. It's a structural position. It's not like one person has power. It's that this one person is in this position in the symbolic order that gives them power. And that's what capital is this overarching symbolic order with all these faceted aspects to it, and trying to just point the finger at this one capitalist over here is really absurd. And part of us, especially in America, and we have such just a basic naive empiricism about everything. What is real is concrete individuals. And so we have trouble with structural thought, right? Systematic thought. We think in terms of empirical particulars. And so, again, that's, I think, why a lot of what Marx has to say is somewhat hard for a lot of Americans to get a hold of, because we just, in our basic horizon or default setting, don't think in structuralist terms. We're naturally empiricists.
I think that's a good point. I have a really good example of like this, and it's like on the leftist side. So there's a movie called Sorry to Bother You, and Steve and I saw this together, where essentially there's, the one evil capitalist. He's like turning people into horses, and it's a very like explicitly leftist movie. It's like the director's a straight up communist. It's great, but the biggest issue with it is that at the end, they win because they kill, like they come in and they like kill and they attack the one like CEO guy, the one evil CEO who's like the evil person. But at the end, have they really done anything? Because, someone else is going to come and like replace him. Anyway, companies have boards of directors. Just because once like the CEO is gone doesn't mean the company is gone and those practices are gone. But like in a bigger system, all of these companies are happening. The system remains the same. Nothing has broken down. One element is coming out. It's almost like a hydra. You cut off one head, but in fact, you've only made it stronger.
That was, Who else has seen that? Anyone else? Mike, have you seen sort of?
I haven't. I was just going to say, though, that I totally agree with Sky. And I think that, when it comes to us trying to talk to people about this, when they're new to this, I think that basic distinction between structure and element, maybe that's even too jargony for some people, but it at least gives us a concept to work with. Like she was,
Sky?
Saussure. I was going to go into Saussure. Saussure makes that distinction, right? There's the synchronic system, the structure, and then there's particular elements. And so if you use a linguistic analogy, right, you talk about a word and how the word tree only means what it means in relation to other elements in this structure. Bark, leaves, green, brown, right? There's all these other words that the word tree gets associated with that give it its meaning. And another way to talk about this kind of structure element relationship is to use a basic example of the game of chess. Zizek has done this in Zizek has done this in How to Read Lacan, and Deleuze and Guattari are really good on this. They talk about chess versus the game of Go in 1,000 Plateaus. But you can see in chess, each piece can move in specific ways in specific contexts. And each piece, each movement of each piece is determined by how the other ones move. So the queen in chess is the most powerful piece, but her power is really determined precisely by the limitations in the movements of the other pieces. It's all this symbolic relationality that give the queen this upper hand. And to talk like D&G, the pieces are coded, right? In other words, they have this symbolic determination, a structural determination, And that's precisely what Marx is trying to highlight. And again, it's hard to get people to see that, but once you give them these basic examples, whether we're use the linguistic example or you talk about chess, they start to get it. Like, okay, yeah, I understand how the pawn in chess is the lowest in power, so to speak, because of its relationships to the other pieces and how they differ. And so, yeah, I mean, in structuralist terminology, we use this abstract language and talk about, you know, the system of differences or whatever, right? But ultimately, it boils down to being able to explain structure and system to people who don't necessarily think in those terms usually.
And Mikey, I was going to ask. So, I had a chance to quickly review your notes that you had shared with us. I think you might have shared us in our actual event, but
I don't know. I think they're just on my page right now.
It's just on your page. Well, I took a look over, and there was a point when you listed out like 5 or 6 points, and you said that these are different elements of the
capital.
Yeah, and you said that traditional political economy had only taken into account 3, maybe. Yeah, could you? Because what you're talking about with chess and all of this, when we talk about capitalism as a social order, that's one of the things that it seems like Ricardo and those people had not been thinking about really. Could you go more into all of those really quick, those elements?
Yeah. So what he gets at here, and of course, look, if we go beyond Marx and we start talking about Deleuze and Guattari and we start talking about Baudrillard, of course, capital becomes much more complicated, or Debord, right? Because now capital also becomes these images, the pop culture images. It's the media images that Baudrillard's talking about. It gets even more elaborate when we hit like the consumer period. But just in Marx's day, what he was critiquing, how he viewed capital, there's essentially 6, I guess you could say 6 elements here, right? But capital is essentially the networked structural relationships between these 6 elements. So you have raw materials, which are just wood, water, land, all of the basic things that we go to work on and transform into commodities or use in the production of commodities. So you have raw materials. Then you have the instruments of production used to make even more new instruments of production or to gather more raw materials, right? Which is essentially just, technology. Then you have the means of subsistence, which is used to produce labor, the reproduction of labor power. So you have means of subsistence. And I say means of subsistence, you can throw in labor power there, or you could even say labor power is a 7th element. It depends on how you want to think about that. But raw materials, instruments of labor or means of production, means of subsistence or labor power, those 3 are what the classic bourgeois political economists, Smith, Ricardo, they consider that to be capital. And if that's how you define capital, there's really nothing problematic. It's just a certain way we're going about organizing these 3 things. It seems harmless, seems unproblematic. But what Marx wants to bring into the picture, and what he talks about, is this 4th thing, which are social relations. So in a mode of production, you have 2 main regimes or sides of it, which is productive forces of production, which is everything I just said, and relations of production, which is the social relations, right? And so that's what he's adding in here to this definition of capital, is that not only is it raw materials, means of production, and labor power that make up capital, it's also certain social relations, social systems. And again, so a system like a tribal society couldn't produce capitalism as we know it. Feudalism couldn't have capitalism in it as we know it. And they couldn't because they had different social relations, different codings, different sign regimes. There's different ways we can talk about this, but that's what Marx is bringing in. And so the 5th one is another, okay, this one you could throw in with Smith and Ricardo, now that I think about it, which is the sum of commodities, right? Marx talks about this, I mean, in part when he talks about accumulated labor. Accumulated labor has to do with all of the labor that has been produced up to this point, right? And part of what he's saying implicitly is look at all this amazing stuff that we've produced, right? We could use this in so many amazing ways, but no, we can't, because we're subservient to it. And all we can really use all this stuff for is just to keep augmenting it, just to keep producing surplus value, capital. And we're not allowed to actually deterritorialize it, free it, use it in ways that go outside of the capitalist accumulation principle. We're locked into that. And so in that way, that's what he means when he says living labor is basically subservient to accumulated labor. And part of accumulated labor would be the sum of commodities in a society at a given point. And then the sixth facet would, again, I guess I just touched on that, the dominance of accumulated labor over living labor. So that's, you see, there's these elements and they exist in a network of relationships to each other. And that's where we're getting this kind of proto-structuralism in Marx.
So it's kind of like, okay, so what would it be like to see this, to see what it looks like? Because I know that like something like capital is technically abstract, and you don't really, it's not like you see it very empirically, just like on the street, but you do, though, in a certain sense, right? Because there are people who wield power, they have wealth, they're able to invest into certain projects that are going to make them more money, and they have a bigger say in how things are going to go in society. They're not just wielding the product of their own labor that they've saved and been, careful in growing. No, they're also wielding accumulated labor of other people. So
we can also talk about it as dead labor, right? I mean, I think he talks about it like that in Capital. But no, I mean, the capital in its like purest form is this cycle, this logic, right? But it does have embodiments. When you walk in the coffee shop, well, the coffee shop itself is capital. It's part of what is going into the owner making profits. And so capital can be honestly something you hold in your hand. But again, that's just one element. The cycle, no, you can't see it and you can't really, get a grip on it. And that's why it's difficult for people to understand it. I mean, think about how much America right now, everybody's talking about capitalism, but how many people actually talk about capital and have clue one about what it actually is? They'll just say, well, it's money. No, it's not. Capital is not money. You could say that money's a part of it when it's used in a certain way, but capitalism is not moneyism. And so that's what it's very important for us to be able to talk to people about what capital is and why we on the left have such an issue with it, because the vast majority of them don't have any clue what it's actually about.
Does anyone want to talk about how does democracy or authoritarianism factor in to capital, its existence?
Well, at the very end, I just kind of tag on. Look, if the whole structure of the system works to make capitalists have more and more power, meaning more and more social influence, more and more clout, they're the ones who can buy elections, we can't, right? It undermines democracy while claiming to spread it all over the world, right? I mean, people it's not democratic because we do not have an equal say in how things go, what the government does, how our tax money gets used, right? That's the big problem here, is that capitalism claims to be this great agent of democracy when in fact it's constantly undermining it. Yeah, and we could probably use Baudrillard here and talk about simulation, because it does simulate democracy, but it doesn't actually make good on it. It doesn't, there's no real referent to it, because all it really does is make the vast majority of us have little to no power, and a few on the top have a lot.
Right. And by necessity, right? And so capital, there's also just like, if you don't, if whether you make $10,000 or $50,000 a year or $150,000 a year, if someone can ultimately lay you off, fire you, close down your store, your factory, wherever you're at, whatever it is that you're doing, you ultimately are putting all of this work into something that someone else gets to make definitive decisions about. You don't have any ultimate say, or even like a substantial say in how things play out there. So like that's another way that it's like anti-democratic.
As Richard Wolff emphasizes that a lot, right? He's big on the idea of democracy in the workplace.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we've got about 15 more minutes here to touch on the other aspects of this. I guess, okay, so capital and wage labor. Wage labor and capital is the name of this essay. Wage labor and capital are the two fundamental concepts being developed here. One of the main points that Marx makes is that the two cannot stand alone.
Yeah, they cannot. One cannot exist without the other, and they both require each other to continue.
They create this kind of emergent and reciprocally determined, which reciprocally, right? Meaning that they each affect the other. Determined, meaning that each one helps cause the other, or secure the other, or perpetuate the other. Emergent, meaning that neither exists without the other. They both emerge out with one another, locked in like that. So capital is propelled and fed by waged labor, and wage labor, the fact that it is labor that gets a wage, that it is paid in the first place, is fed by capital. But that wheel, that cycle itself, is perpetuated and driven by the fact that those laborers working for a wage are always having extra sucked away into some anonymous force that they have no say in what happens with, and that they have no ultimate power over, that they will always, for the rest of their lives, so long as they live under capitalism, have to pour themselves out on the market, always trying to make themselves look better than the people around them, their class. So the proletariat class is always forced to try to make the others around them look worse than they are by stepping up on their backs to say, look at me, I'm much better, hire me instead. And so under, there's like this, all of this extra labor that we do that we don't get paid in writing cover letters and developing portfolios and trying to create this narrative about how this job is the right one for me. I've been made for this. My whole life logically leads up to the conclusion of you hiring me. Yeah.
I would just add, and I wish he would have emphasized this a little bit more. What you're saying about wage labor and capital, in a sense, going hand in hand, though not in a good way, that they're mutually determining. One aspect of this that makes it work is, I guess I would call it the indiscernibility of necessary labor and surplus labor. So what I'm getting at here is when exploitative labor emerged, right? Slaves knew that they were just getting fucked over by the master. I have to do all this shit because this person owns me, right? And when you get to feudalism, so basically all the slaves' labor was exploitative labor, period. When you get to feudalism, the serfs would work 2 days of the week for themselves to produce their means of subsistence, to produce to engage in necessary labor for the continuation of their life. And then for 4 days, they would produce for the Lord. So there was a very clear distinction. Today, I'm working for me, and these products are mine and my family's. And then the other 4 days, I'm working for the Lord, and these products produced on those days are his. Very clear where necessary labor begins and where it ends and turns into surplus labor, where you're laboring for the other.
Okay, we're calling surplus labor here those 4 days where you're working for the feudal lord. So your necessary labor was the labor that you did for your means of subsistence, and then the extra 4 days, you're like, all right, I'm doing this for that asshole in the castle over there.
Exactly. And it was very clear. You knew exactly what you were doing. When it comes to wage labor, there's an indiscernibility between your necessary labor and your surplus labor. When the barista's working a 10-hour shift, the barista doesn't know, oh, right now I'm doing my necessary labor for my wage. Right now I'm doing my surplus labor. It's all blurred together. There's no distinction there. And that's part of what's so fundamental in making a lot of people think that they're just, I just go to work and I get paid. There's no other, you know, a lot of people don't even see the exploitation in it, precisely because the blurring of necessary labor and surplus labor. Most people walk away from work having some implicit feeling that they got screwed over, but they don't know how they got screwed over. The serf knows very well how he's getting screwed over. The slave knows very well how he's getting screwed over. And the reason why industrial capitalism works so much is because of this blurring. And Marx gets at this, but at least in this essay, it's not very clear. And I wish it would have been highlighted, because I think it really helps understand why this mechanism is so powerful and confusing. And so I'll just add real quick that this whole thing about the blurring of necessary labor and surplus labor, it hides why this blurring serves to conceal how wage labor is necessary for the production of industrial capitalism. So usury, for example, I loan you this much money, and when you pay me back, you give me an extra 10%, right? That's existed long before, but usury is a kind of proto-capital, a larval form of capital, because it's one value exchanging for another, and at the end of the cycle, you have more value than what you started with, right? Well, merchant capital. Okay, merchants had access to all of these different cities and territories, right? And so they'd be in one territory and they'd buy up a bunch of some product, and then they'd go over, sail across the sea and go to another territory and sell it really, really high, right? Because you had this diversity of markets. These markets were isolated, and so you could take advantage of that, right? But these were marginal practices, usury and merchant capital. They didn't run the world. The world wasn't built around them or centered on them. And for industrial capital to emerge, it said, look, I can't, you just loaning money and then getting interest back. That's not going to do it. And capital seeks to always expand its market, so it tends towards globalization, not localities or isolated cities or cultures. It spreads, it globalizes. And so it said, look, I have to find a way to increase, to make profits. I can't do it in these older ways. They're inefficient. I need this thing called industrial labor to produce on larger scale, so on and so forth. And the profit comes in through the difference between the amount of value the laborer produces and the amount of value the laborer receives back in a wage. And that's the difference between necessary labor and surplus labor. But the power of capitalism, I said all that just to go back to where we already were. The power in that mechanism lies in the indistinguishability of the two. I mean, phenomenologically speaking, right?
Yeah, and there's also something fundamental about capitalism itself, that there is so much surplus labor always being done. It's never that you're just producing enough for you and the people involved to have a decent life. It's that there is this, because of the imperative to compete, you have to basically put as much work in a given hour as possible to stay competitive against other laborers, but also work basically the longest days possible, right? To maximize the surplus labor produced in a day or a week's time, so that where does that go? It doesn't go back to the people involved in the processes. It's so that that money can be, so that labor can be turned into capital to be basically sent elsewhere, always elsewhere. And then so there's the different kinds of competition as well. There's competition between the capitalists. There's competition between the workers. And what was the third kind of capitalism? I mean, competition. There was a third.
Between workers and capitalists. So the capitalists are fighting amongst themselves to sell the most and make the most. The workers are competing with each other to get employed and to have the better jobs. And then you have workers fighting with capitalists in their own dynamic. They want to work less hours. The capitalists want them to work more. The workers don't want to have to work as intensely, obviously. The capitalists want them to work more intensely. So there's this whole network of competition between capitalists here, workers here, and then capitalists and workers.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. What are some other things? Are there any things we haven't hit on, or anything that you want to bring up?
I think, like, kind of towards the beginning of the essay, he talks more about wages in specific, and I feel like we haven't discussed that enough, because one of the really important things that I feel like he talks about is the exchange value of our labor, and so like the exchange value of the wages, and we kind of got into that, and like the value of the like wages, and yeah, you can make more, but really, what does it mean? It's all based on like what the exchange value and what you can exchange that for. So he talks about, you know, how much does your meat or your bread cost, and if that price is going up, then your like the money that you're making and your wage doesn't really matter. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, is the wage itself and how that affects you and how that affects the laborer.
Have you guys discussed the three aspects of the wage? Because when I was driving home, it cut out for a little bit, so I don't know if the nominal, real, and relative wage.
He doesn't call it that in this, does he?
Yeah.
Nominal?
I think he uses nominal wage.
Yeah.
Jeez. I wonder if that's missing from my abridged version here in the reader. Did you read from the reader, or did you read from the archive?
No, I got an actual standalone copy of Wage, Labor, and Capital.
Okay, so I think that it somehow isn't in here, because I don't remember the word nominal even existing.
Well, here, let me see.
Yeah, write it down.
Let me give you the reference here first, where he's talking about this. It's either in, let's see.
Well, and while you do that really quick, I just want to try to reiterate what I tried to say earlier that I kind of dropped. That labor power being a commodity means that it's subject to a law of commodities in capitalism, which is whenever we figure out a way to make more in the same amount of time, rather than that surplus going back to everyone involved, that surplus instead has to be siphoned into other projects, and that the price of a commodity, almost, even though that let's just say that I'm able to produce something in half the time that you are because I made some breakthrough today. Well, because you're going to be able to figure out how I made that breakthrough so that you can then become as competitive as I am, you're ultimately going to catch up with me, right? So if I have some like cutting edge machine, my competitors don't have that cutting edge machine yet, you're going to have it. And so even though I'm able to undercut them a little bit and then still be making a huge like margin of profit, the tendency is always going to be, because of that competition existing, that I'll have to push back down the price to basically being the cost of the production itself. And the cost of the production itself for wage labor is the means of subsistence. And so because so with pencils, you'll always have to drive the price will always have to come back down to the cost of the production of the pencils. You might just have like this small margin of profit down there. The same thing's going to happen with the price of the wage, or the price of the labor, which is the wage. That will have to come back down to production itself. Now, production itself is in the most simplified kind of work. It's literally you just standing there. Like the most simplified kind of work is like, we just need someone to man this door. And so you kind of stand there. Or it could be like, the most simple kind of work is like, here, you put this here and you put this here. And that's the most simplified kind of work. So we could just replace you with anybody else. Cool. Well, in that case, the cost of their wage is going to be literally whatever it takes just to keep the average person alive. That's the base means of subsistence. But if the kind of work you're giving them, instead of putting this here, becomes transplanting this heart to this person's body, all of a sudden you've got to pay for that person's 12 years of education because they're a heart surgeon now. And so different kinds of education necessary for the different kinds of goals factor in. But then also as capitalism gets to be more and more complex, there's also just all of the social demarcation. To be a worker of a certain class requires showing signs that you are of that class, which means that at a certain point, you've got to make sure that this person has enough money to be able to show that they are of that class, like so they can drive a Lexus or whatever. So, and then it's like commodities are no longer just for consumption. There's also conspicuous consumption, which maybe you enjoy it, maybe you don't, but at the end of the day, you basically have to have a Rolex to be taken seriously in certain settings.
And that's Baudrillard's sign value. That's where he says, look, in the post-war society, of course, this kind of thing has always existed, right? You could always say that, well, the king's crown is a kind of sign value for his status and all that, right? But what you have is a proliferation and a systemization of sign value, which obviously takes on the form of conspicuous consumption a lot. But for Baudrillard, that's what consumer society does, is it integrates sign value into the commodity. And we can't just talk about commodities any longer in terms of use value and exchange value. We have to incorporate sign value because it's such a main, like essentially for him, he thinks that that's primarily what makes the world go round, is that use value. Marx talks about exchange value has come into the dominant position. In the post-war consumer society, Baudrillard would say, yeah, and exchange value has been usurped by sign value.
Right.
And everything is organized around that.
2 months ago, for those who didn't know, we read Baudrillard's After the Orgy. And in it, there's a short section where he talks about the three kinds of value. There's use value, how you use the thing. There's exchange value, what the thing is worth in the market in exchanging it for other things. And then there's the sign value, which Mikey just touched on. And then he was talking about, in the postmodern condition, basically, there's fractal value, which is just basically talking about the indiscernibility that you were talking about earlier between the necessary labor versus the surplus labor. There's the same thing in the postmodern condition. There's this indiscernibility between the three kinds of value. They all get so mixed up now that like it's just weird thing.
Yeah, they almost lose any kind of systematic determination. It's just some things are, this is popular, this is considered valuable, and then it's gone, and it's almost like there's a breakdown in the systematicity of value.
Yeah.
But no, what I was just in case you want, it's at the end of let's see, where he's talking about the different kinds of wages, the three aspects of wages and all that. It's at the end of chapter 6. And so that's where he goes into, he talks about nominal wages, real wages, and relative wages. And so just to explain that distinction real quick, nominal wages has to do just with the money price of your wage. You make $6 an hour. You make $10 an hour, right? Those are nominal wages. Real wages is if you make $10 an hour, real wages has to do with how much buying power that $10 has. So if the things you need to live are relatively cheap compared to your nominal wage, you have a good amount of buying power. If the means of subsistence, all those commodities you need to live and exist, skyrocket, then your nominal wage counts for nothing, buys you shit. And so that's where this importance lies. And when anytime we talk about wages, nominal wage is irrelevant. What's important is real wages. How much does this wage actually get you? And again, I've seen different reports, right? You could say that, you know, people want this $15 minimum wage, right? Which would be a nominal wage. But if you actually go back and you compare it to the 1950s, I've seen things where it says, well, the minimum wage to have the same buying power that we had like in the 50s and 60s, the minimum wage would be more like $30 or $40 an hour to match the buying power.
What the fuck?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Well, because the original intention of the minimum wage was for a single wage earner to be able to support an entire family.
Right.
It wasn't for, someone to barely scrape by living with 6 roommates. Like the original intention has drifted as time has gone on, as a result of capital and the way that we respond to wages and, the means of subsistence, the bar is being lowered as society changes. Because now the means of subsistence don't include, this expectation that a single wage earner is taking care of an entire family of 3 or 4 people.
Right.
It is you are taking care of just you. And this idea that minimum wage earners are, teenagers in after school jobs or working part-time to get yourself through school, like just a little bit extra pocket money. No, that's not what it is. And that was not the intention when it was created. And that is what it has become. And so that's how this societal structure and this idea of what the means of subsistence get to be has changed as, time has gone on and the expectations for minimum wage have changed.
You're absolutely right. And I think this is one of the really important things for us on the left to be able to talk about with people is real wages. Because this is one of those moments where you can really, in some sense we do. If you take all the jargon and the philosophy out of it, we want people to be pissed off about capitalism. Well, this is one way that you can do it and help them understand their precarity, right? Is through the concept of real wage. What our grandparents made compared to us, it's right. It's a wedge issue, yeah. And just talking about wages, well, everybody just talks about wages, they leave this distinction out, and that blurs things. And this distinction needs to be made. And just again, and relative wage. Okay, so we know nominal wage, that's the money price of your wage, $10 an hour. Real wages is what that $10 an hour gets you out in the world, what you can buy with it. Relative wage has to do with the value of your wage in comparison to capital, to surplus value. So the most ideal situation for a capitalist class at a given time is for real wages to go up. This is what you had in the 50s and 60s, right? So consumers and workers are happy because they're able to buy all this shit and live the suburban life and go out shopping and eat restaurants, do all that, right? Because their real wages are really good, right? But that's in a sense a trick. Yes, on some level, we would love for everybody to have good real wages right now because we want people to be able to survive. But if you're giving people real wages that are good, and capital, the relative wage is going down, meaning your wage in proportion to capital gets lesser and lesser and lesser. Capital is increasing in relationship to your wage. That means the capitalists gain more power, more social influence, and all of that. So yeah, you can go buy shit at the mall that you don't need and be happy doing it, but you're constantly giving up more and more social power, more influence, blah, 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 blah. So capitalists get the upper hand while you're happy. Right, you're getting to buy shit at the mall in zombie mode, congratulations, while they make off and run the world.
Right. And then in the last 20 years, we've seen it get to the point where, and you talk about this all the time in posts and stuff like that, but now it's like you don't even have the money to go to the mall. Generation Z, especially, like, it's not like you have money to go to the mall. It's now like maybe you have money for an app every once in a while, but most of the stuff you're consuming is actually just, you know, it's this virtual stuff. Yeah, bare bones, like you're going thrifting for your clothes, and then you're using like free apps for everything else, but they're not free because what powers them is your attention and your, thought and behavior patterns that are making the biggest companies in the world, the richest companies in the world right now, Facebook, etc. And I mean, yeah, everything else that you do have is a subscription service like Netflix or Hulu or Spotify or Audible or Patreon subscriptions, whatever. Those are all, and then obviously like subscription services also include your phone, also include your rent, your rental agreement with your landlord or your, I guess usually not even a landlord anymore. It's usually more of like
it's a company.
Just some company, yeah. So rentism, which is, ties back to our For Futures conversation. That's the one that we're basically in right now, where every once in a while I realize that some of my students or peers just they're not like, I realize they have disposable income, that they can eat anywhere they want, that they have a car, that they don't have to like pay for, and it's just like it's always kind of like a shock because like I think I've basically just become used to most students around here. Well, at least the ones I talk to, I suppose, and this is probably just class, but they fucking work. And they don't have disposable income. They work and go to school at the same time. And it's infuriating. It's depressing because you can't really find the time and energy to study or to grow with your friends or get involved with various kinds of organizations and see what you're good at or interested in when you need to be taking all of the extra time and energy that you have in your week and putting it into work that you would otherwise be putting into homework. So it's like work, homework, sleep, and then you're, social stuff, reading because I want to try to understand capitalism, and then the whole trying to understand capitalism thing, well, why would that fucking matter? Well, because you don't have any time and energy. You actually have to maximize every extra drop of time and energy you have in your week to put into those other things, so you can't actually learn about capitalism and why you don't have any time and energy left over.
Wow, that's my whole life right there.
Right. And, I would say if you try to take the perspective of capital itself, it's fucked up by putting your generation and the Zoomers, everybody, Generation Z. I like Zoomers more. I've
not heard that yet.
Yeah, that people are calling them Zoomers. I'm like, yeah, that's better than Generation Z. Zoomers.
I'm like trapped between Boomers and Zoomers. This is a terrible place to be.
And so, here's the thing. If you're capital, you want a middle class that bumps around the mall and goes out to eat, and that's life, and kind of end of history mind state where you don't think politics. If you do, you have some conversation with your neighbors about it when you're drinking, and nobody gets mad, and there's no tension because there's this fundamental consensus both share. There's just little wedge issues that they might disagree on, abortion or whatever, but overall the consensus is there. I grew up in that consensus. My neighbors, my parent, my mom's friends, none of them ever argued over fascism or communism. They didn't even think like it was just the capitalist consumer neoliberal consensus. And we talk about what happened in the 80s with neoliberalism coming in, but they didn't recognize that. They just were living life, and the basic consensus was capitalism's good. The question is, do we need more regulation, less regulation? But there were never any like conversations that ended friendships over this, right? And they had that consensus, so there wasn't much to care about. Nobody was really political. Again, growing up as an Xer, my idea of being political was, we want to legalize weed, man. Like that was being deeply political for us. And the cops suck. Cops are assholes. So that was the idea of politics for us. And your generation and the younger one have been thrown into politics so heavily because it's like Heideggerian, right? It's like an unreadiness to hand where the world itself breaks down. The world is not functioning and you have to deal with it in its like broken, unready to hand mode. And
seriously though, I just got this laptop with student loans that is fucking epic. I needed a good laptop so that I could edit video because I'm getting into video production. And so I buy this laptop and then all of a sudden for the first time in my life, I'm using like a current model. I've never used a current model of computer ever. And it is crazy. I pull the thing out and I'm like working and I'm like, this is like seamless. It's just like, it works. Mm-hmm. And then so much of the stress in my life up until this point, I didn't even realize, and a lot of my hatred of technology was literally just me fucking not having like current technological models.
Oh yeah. I remember dial-up days. Oh my God.
But like you're forced to like be in this place where, you know, companies are built with planned obsolescence, but like our reality means that we have to live in that obsolete space because, you know, my phone, you know, your phone after a certain point, it's not going to keep updating. The apps that you're using are going to move beyond those, but you don't have the means to update with them. So you're stuck in this weird spot where you can't use the things that you need to be using to like have those like class signifiers too. And it's like a weird spot to live in.
You're being
like
throttled.
Everyone else is also in that weird spot, but we're pretending like we're not. Because like society is like, no, you have to have those, you know, class signifiers that we're talking about. But we're pretending like we have them when we don't. And I think especially in like this generation, because my parents are doing great, you know, in their very like middle class society, and they have no concept of the life that I live, where you have to live in a house that's falling down for a year that should be condemned because there's no other places in the city where you can live and like afford food at the same time that you afford rent. Like, and then they're like, no, you are being paid $10 an hour. When I was in school, I got paid $5 an hour, but their, you know, tuition was like $700 a semester. And you know, what is inflation? Because another element is that inflation means that like, they're like, oh, I only had, you know, minimum wage was only $5 when I was, you know, when I was going to school, and it's $7 now. So you're doing better than us. But at the same time, if you look at the reality, comparing those two like actual things, you know, that $5 took you a lot farther than the $7 today. I can barely buy a full meal at McDonald's with $7 an hour.
Like, I mean, my mom tells me about when she, you know, these old stories that sound like myths to us. Oh yeah, I used to go and get a burger and fries and milkshake for 30 cents. It's like, you know, and what you're saying.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah, my mom existed in those times. I mean, it sounds like 400 years ago or some shit, but no, it was in her lifetime. But no, what you're talking about, that's exactly the nominal wage versus real wage distinction and boomers don't get that distinction. That's why they can they give you millennials so much shit, and it has to do with their failure to understand this basic distinction.
Yeah. It seems like boomers in their little bubble of privilege that grants them the, oh, your life's okay while remaining willfully ignorant. But miss a lot of these kinds of distinctions, don't they?
But it's not just boomers too. It's Gen X too.
So what is Gen X versus boomers?
I'm Gen X.
You're Gen X. Okay.
Well, so now people are saying I'm technically a Zennial. So I guess we're giving there's like cusps now of generations, like in astrology or some shit. But I was born in 82. They say that millennials start in 1980, but every millennial I have ever known or talked to says, no, you are an Xer. So part of it is just an attitude and disposition and outlook and all of that.
Well, I think largely usually considered like what kinds of technologies were around.
Yeah.
Your formative
Because,
years,
like,
right?
I would be a millennial, but Anne is a Gen Z. So, like,
Yeah.
but I honestly believe that these kinds of like lines that we're drawing here they're hard because they blur, which is why people are like, well, I'm on the cusp because like I was born in 1996, which is like the year that you cut off, or like depending on like the four types of definitions when you Google what years do millennials like live in, you know, sometimes it's 98 is the cutoff, sometimes it's 96, sometimes it's 1994. It doesn't matter,
Right.
because, you know, also because age, like categorizing people by age is a bad categorization technique in general. It's helpful in certain things. And so in this conversation, it provides benefit, but like, especially as the groups of people become so diverse and the world in both like race and class, and like the lives that we lead are so different from each other within these generational gaps, because there are people who are millennials who grew up in a time where a lot of people had access to, you know, telephones. Like I grew up, I had a cell phone when I was 11. As soon as I hit middle school, I had a cell phone. But like there are people who are my age who live in America who have never had access to the internet.
And I didn't have a cell phone until I was like 17.
Yeah.
Right? I had the internet when I was like 15, and it was dial-up. And I had dial-up a lot longer than normal people because I was living in rural Idaho. And then there's also like the being homeschooled, not having access to the kinds of social relations and then the kinds of basic like educational resources that a normal person of my generation would have. And so it's just like, yeah, these lines, ways of categorizing, like they can be useful, but they can also be as misleading, because it's like
They can be
I don't really
limiting.
I don't really see myself as belonging to or fitting into any of the generations that I get attributed to. So
for me, it's weird. I absolutely right that there's benefits and problems that comes. I feel very much like an Xer. Like I think about I think in terms of the old world, right? I have never really become acclimated to the internet age. I feel like I've lost something, and you know, the mall, the video store, the arcade, all of that was my childhood. And point is, though, I think what's interesting about these generational identities is that they are the products of capitalism. It's strange to think about it, but there's only been like 5 of these. There's Greatest Generation, which was World War II, the Boomers, the Xers, Millennials, and now Zoomers. And it's precisely how capitalism accelerates temporality, and it has to keep producing waves of new commodities and waves of new everyday technologies that produce these quasi-generational identities. And Deleuze and Guattari talk a lot about this in their concepts of reterritorialization and recoding. That is this fundamental mechanism in capitalism. Baudrillard talks about it, and he talks about how we now live according to commodity time and not human time. And what he means is that for the vast majority of human history, right, up until basically the post-war era, human beings live and existed in the same world throughout their lifespan, that the basic fundamental everyday coordinates remain the same. So churches, the church you went to outlived you, and the tavern that you went to outlives you, right? Well, now we outlive our commodities. So when I think about my basic coordinates, right, I think video store, I think mall, I think NES and Super Nintendo. I think about all of these basic coordinates that as a kid help you get familiarized with the world. By the time you're an adult, they're gone. And now you're left in a sense of feeling like to talk like Heidegger, you're Dasein without a world, where your world's gone. And now you have to shift and try to live in this new world. And this is a fundamental problem that only the last, 70 years or something has created. And by the time you're in your mid 30s, you feel like your world escapes you. And that's why we're going to see more and more hyper nostalgia get generated. Nostalgia is a modern phenomenon, the way we think about it, right? It's, you know, why do we see Ready Player One and movies like this? It's because people feel like they're lacking the basic fundamental coordinates that they were born into. And it's a very perplexing thing.
Oh, I hated that movie. My dad, I watched this movie with my dad, who would be a Gen X, and I hated it because I'm so tired of 80s nostalgia. And he's like, it's everything that my childhood was. And I was like, this is a dumb, boring movie. It's overproduced, it's dumb, and it's boring, and it's playing on nostalgia, and there's nothing else in this movie.
I'll give you so here's the thing. I have mixed feelings about it. I like it precisely because of what it gestures towards in the culture. This type of structural nostalgia we're going to keep seeing. I think it highlights that. I totally agree. It could have been a classic like a Matrix or Fight Club, one of them, but they failed. And it had all this potential to get at something really interesting philosophically, but it didn't pull it off. A much better movie for this type of nostalgia, though, is one Jonah Hill just made called Mid-90s. I was blown away by it, and I'll tell you why. It's because it gets at nostalgia, but it does it in a much smarter way. It's not merely, oh, hey, look, there's a xenomorph, and there's Goro, and there's the DeLorean. It doesn't just throw easy pop culture references at you. It's nostalgic, but it's I want to call it a micro nostalgia, where what it's really getting at are the basic ways that we interacted with each other in the mid-90s as teenagers. The way we would interact with each other behind the gas station when we're just sitting there talking, smoking weed. It was basic kind of behavioral social interactions that really kind of leave you like, that's what it was to be there. It's not just referencing our music or our clothes or our movies or whatever. It's a deeper form of nostalgia, and I think it's done much, much better.
I think that gets to basically this different thing because, you know, millennials and especially Gen Z, I think one of the defining things about them is the fact that we grew up in this time where technology was, you know, just so rapidly changing. So, you know, I grew up, I had cassette tapes, I had VHSs, I went to the video store, you know, when I was in elementary school. But by the time I was in 8th grade, those things had disappeared. Blockbuster was gone. It was the very end of that. So, you know, it's not that these things, it's not that, you know, those were the touchstones of my childhood and that these are the ways that I defined it, because at the same time, it was introducing cell phones and this new way of communicating with each other, where I think that these new generations, our touchstone is this rapid change and this fluidity and this, we have to always be changing. And that almost defines, you know, you have base touchstones, but, you know, we don't live, my parents don't live in the houses that I grew up in anymore. They, you know, they moved 3 or 4 times in our childhood where, you know, my grandparents, you know, their parents were born in the house that they were born in. And then my grandparents are going to die in that house anyway. Like, those are different things. We're not settled the way that we used to be because we can't be. And so these new generations are growing up in that. And so it's almost as if we are not anchored to this idea of nostalgia where we don't have that kind of nostalgia where like, oh, we used to have all these things and then they were ripped away from us and now we want those because it's a better time. Because we have never had a better time where we had that stability, we had those touchstones to cling to, because things have been changing so often that the next year we have something new and shinier and prettier that we can, you know, have for this time. So it's a really interesting way to look at it, because like I have no connection. I mean, I have nostalgia, but my nostalgia is a lot different.
But here's sorry.
Oh, just my nostalgia is a lot different than these like I guess ideas and institutions of places and things, as opposed to, you know, like I guess I was wrapping up my comment anyway. So
I'll just say, so with the 1950s and 60s, we had, I like Baudrillard's essay, right, after the orgy. I think it kind of was this this orgy, so to speak, right? Where the scary thought is it's the best that it's ever going to get. And so we're just going to stay in this state of decline. So by the 70s and 80s, right, especially the 80s, the economics had become problematic. That's why you have Reagan and Thatcher come in with neoliberalism. Oh, we're in these recessions and there's this economic problem, blah, blah, blah. But you had the pop culture peak. And I think you can argue that pop culture was at its peak in the 80s. And so that kind of got people through. And then in the 90s, very violent decade. Yeah, but you have hip hop. So there's this whole new pop culture phenomenon. And so around the 80s, though, yeah, things start accelerating more and more and more. But for us growing up in mall culture, right, it was inconceivable to us that we would one day live without the mall. Malls are basically non-existent at this point. There's 2 in this city where I live, and there used to be 30 of them. And even when you go to the mall, it's not really the mall anymore. It doesn't even feel like the mall. So I just think about that and going, there's a lot of kids right now who think it's inconceivable that they're not going to lose their smartphone, right? That this thing's going away, or YouTube's going away, Amazon's going away, Facebook's going away. To us, it was like the videos, it was Blockbuster and the mall and all that, and they're not going anywhere. They're like the foundations, right? I think when whatever next wave, whenever it kicks in, where the smartphone gets replaced by something else and these famous websites, YouTube, Facebook, they go away, right? There will be some weird nostalgia even for them.
I disagree. I think that the inherent change is what we are connected to, because we grew up without cell phones. We saw the way that they evolved. I started out with a landline, and then I was like, how am I supposed to live without a landline? And then we got cell phones, and then we got all of these.
We lived in that change too. It wasn't like it's just you guys get accelerated change. We had it too.
And I think that change is inherent, and that's what we have the nostalgia for. Okay.
I think this is a good one to come back to, but we've been on it for 20 minutes longer than we were going to talk. Right. Now, I don't want to cut this off just yet, though, because just for the sake of novelty, what was that comment?
Oh, okay, I'll read it.
So it looks like a person has commented. We're going to touch on that, and then we're going to bounce. I think I know who it is.
Our friend Daniel,
our
friend
Daniel
on the quad,
from the Liberty Club.
He said, public education and fatherless homes are deteriorating society. Thanks subsidized student loans for expensive education. We suffer from central planning.
Oh my God.
Is my fatherless home the reason? Is that,
yeah.
That's
As is typical of classical liberals, you're looking at effects instead of causes because you don't take the time to read books. I think we're done with this conversation. You missed this conversation. You could have actually read the text. You could have come. You could have joined. You could have actually had a conversation with us, but it looked like you decided to wait to come in at the end and posit some non sequitur that literally just fixates on effects instead of causes. But we in this club are critical theorists. We care about getting to causes, not effects. I don't know. Does anyone else want to say anything to that? That's my response to that.
I have nothing to say today.
I mean, it's just like you're coming in on the end of a thing where we've just unpacked so many of the moving parts.
We kind of strayed away from Marx. You missed a lot of the really important stuff if you're still even watching, Danielle.
Okay.
No, but this is real though. This is like, okay, it's like we just spent like an hour unpacking all the reasons why that statement doesn't make sense, and then we're just talking about some kind of experiential stuff in our own lives and generational stuff with how things change. But the stuff, like the substance about like why, for instance, families are breaking up, for instance, why people are on the move, for instance, why education is in crisis, for instance, why, what were some of the other examples of what they touched on?
I think it was fatherless homes and subsidized student loans.
Oh my God. That is the most superficial things to focus on.
Oh, we just need more Oedipus and everything will be fixed.
That's my viewpoint. Well, you
What-
should.
Our clubs are open to the public. Our meetings are like, you could have come tonight. You could come
Yeah.
next week. We
Yeah.
do this every week.
We do this
Read a
every
new
week.
thing.
We post about it all week long on our page. The event is public. It's in our events tab.
We meet on campus.
We send emails. We meet on campus. Everyone's invited.
Yeah.
And you could have been a part of the Google Hangout too, so you're welcome to come back. What were you saying about Oedipus, and what does Oedipus have to do with anything?
It said something about like the lack of a father or something. What was it?
Yeah.
Well, if you knew Lacan, then you get into the symbolic father and realize we've all been symbolically castrated anyway, and we don't need an actual literal father with an actual penis there for us to be Oedipalized. So irrelevant.
No, we should just blame women for wanting liberation because that's what's breaking up the house, right?
Yep.
It's our
I mean, the thing is like Marx was like prescient on this. He said that if you that he actually it was in this week's reading that because of competition, the capitalists are always trying to de-skill labor, to simplify it, to make it so that lower entry wage earners are able to take the place of higher wage earners. And part of that is also simplifying the tasks so that in terms of manual labor, women can take the place of men and children can take the place of adults. And so capitalism has been fundamentally opposed to this nostalgic notion of the family for the last over 200 years. It has been breaking up families because, well, when you have fucking children climbing around in mines, working 17-hour days and then dying in there, yeah, that kind of undermines the ability to have like a healthy family unless you're a bourgeois piece of shit.
There's a reason why libertarianism doesn't have a single great philosopher of their own.
Well, wait. Well, no, they don't. They've got a couple of economists that are a big deal.
But they don't have a single great philosopher who would stand by their position. That's not a coincidence.
I also made some notes in the Hangouts comments. Oh, someone made some notes and comments. Hey, oh,
that's kind of
Kravatsov. It's Kravatsov made some notes in Hangouts. Kravatsov, I do not see any of your comments. I only see Kenneth Freeman's.
Does he mean on this?
Kravatsov, are you able to say anything? Are you able to unmic?
Mark and Rose.
Hold on.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just made some comments in the Hangouts chat. If you back out of it and the audio still goes on, there's comments in the app, you know, and probably can do it from the desktop as well.
All we see are kind of. All right. Your comments run another. Okay. How do we change?
Yeah, because I'm on what do you call it? On the app, I can back out of the video while staying in the conversation, and you have the text. You know, basically. Text conversation, people can chat with each other. So it's kind of ongoing.
Maybe we'll be able to figure out. But for now, I think while I'm talking on your. But would you like to have the last word? Maybe tell us a couple of the we love that you had up in your comments.
Well, can you repeat it, please? I'm sorry, there was bad connection for a second. If you were talking to me.
Yeah. So we have this feedback. Coming from the side. I'm hearing myself.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But going to ask you. Wanted to have the last.
Oh, it's just if you're the comments. I was just going. As we were talking, I asked some questions, and whether like talk about the like when the guy was talking about social relations, whether it's related to social reproduction, or whether that was social reproduction comes under labor power. I'm not very good on all the terminology yet, so I've been just listening to podcasts about this stuff, but I don't know all this, all the woods that well. And other things, kind of in another comment I was making, I don't know if you guys heard about David Ellerman's labor theory of property. I've learned about it doing the workplace democracy course on what do you call it, EDX. Talks about how it's fundamentally incorrect to think about the wage labor as a sale of labor, like it's as if a sale relationship. Whereas actually it should be the cooperation contract, not purchase and sale contract, from like a legal point of view or jurisprudence point of view. And that's why he makes case for employee-owned, the businesses versus the capitalist businesses. So, just a couple notes like that I was leaving there behind. So if you guys can read them later. I had a link for that Ellerman thing too. They had a little article on PBS. Makes it easier, to read on that.
I don't know if we'll lose fishing out. The copy and paste into the
Facebook.
Yeah, into the Facebook event. That'd be great. Looks like Daniel in here. Daniel, closing this out. We've got. Welcome to say something. You'll have to unmute yourself, though. If you toggle the mouse around the screen, it should bring up some stuff on the top, and there should be a microphone button that you can click. Crap. Saw shared some stuff in the comments section. That's cool. All right, we're going to close this out. Thank you for joining, everybody. It's been fantastic. Daniel, I would be willing to talk to you about this only under the condition that you actually do the reading. I hope you do. Take care. All right, bye, everybody.
Bye.